Welcome back to section 2 of the Scrape the Planet course. This is the 5th video, I believe, and we're going to be talking about some more design stuff, some more high-level stuff, but something that's a little bit closer to the actual code itself. We're going to be talking about effective and efficient design choices for scraper development. One of the biggest things that I've learned over the last decade of coding experience is that you can majorly avoid a lot of problems and speed up the development process in general by paying a lot of attention to planning and design. You probably already can tell that I put a lot of emphasis on this, and that's, maybe a little bit too much emphasis, maybe a little bit too much planning in the beginning stages. It might take me a little bit longer to get started up. But the programs, the scrapers, the spiders, and all of the other things that I've developed in the past have benefited majorly from those planning stages, from all of the design choices that I made early on. If you've never worked on design and planning of a technical development project, this might be a good starting point for you. It might not. If you have done that work, just know that I understand that this is a complex process, and I acknowledge that my way of doing things may not be the best way. This is the process that I use to design and plan technical projects, from scrapers to spiders to websites to all kinds of other stuff. But it's not the only way. This is just the approach that I use, and there are probably others that exist that are far better and maybe are a little bit more feasible and more efficient. As you develop scrapers and spiders and all kinds of other stuff in the future, just understand that you're going to come up with your own process that might or probably will be better than mine. This is kind of like that first foundational step that I'm going to use to kind of display the way that you can do the design and planning process. So let's start with part 1. Step 1 is determining the problem that you're going to design your scraper or spider around. One of the biggest mistakes that you can make is not approaching scraper development with a problem. Deciding one day, I'm just going to scrape Twitter, or I'm going to gather a bunch of financial data for, no reason, or I'm going to, pull down a bunch of data from this website. It's not really enough. You have to have a problem, and you have to develop a scope around that problem, which we'll talk about here in a second, in order to manage the purpose, the size, and the complexity of the project. Using the scrape Twitter kind of example, you don't have the storage, you don't have the processing power, and you really don't want to scrape all of Twitter. You're going to want to scope that down and kind of develop a problem that you want to actually solve with that data, or you're just going to be scraping data for no reason. The problem is honestly the most important part of planning and design. Technically, it scopes the project in and controls the amount of labor required to develop a scraper, bandwidth required to gather the data, storage required to store the data, and hardware resources required to actually analyze it. There's actually a subset of the internet, I think it's r/data hoarders is a really good example, that just scrapes data and stores data for the sake of scraping and storing data. And if that's your thing, perfectly fine. It's honestly kind of cool. It's awesome to say that you have petabytes of data on a certain niche subject. Not really my thing. I like to kind of scrape and store and analyze data that actually has a problem statement. I like to have a problem to solve with it. So if that's what you want to do, go for it, but I'm not going to kind of gear the course towards that. Having a specific problem in mind also helps you prepare for the mental undertaking that is scraper development. Scraper development and the peripheral tasks around it, like storage, analysis, all of that, it's very difficult, and if you don't have a problem to kind of set yourself to, you're just going to be sitting there spinning your wheels, and you're going to lose motivation because you don't have a specific problem that you want to do. It's kind of a psychological thing. So don't just decide one day that you're going to go up and scrape a bunch of stuff and then get burned out on it because it's actually a lot more difficult, and then you don't have a problem to solve, so you don't really have this end state in mind. You don't have this problem that you're going to solve with your project. Mentally, you need a problem to solve and a goal to strive for to motivate you to undertake the Herculean or Sisyphean task of scraper development. So you start with a problem. I'm going to give you a problem from my own scraping experience that I've kind of talked about a little bit before. On January 6, 2021, extremists loyal to the outgoing Trump presidency storms the United States Capitol in an attempt to hinder the ongoing certification of the election and in general to protest what they saw as a sham election. I'm not going to go into the politics of all of this, but I will say that in the lead up to the January 6th riots, there was a large amount of discussion of potential violence and rioting in right-wing extremist online circles. I was already following a lot of these online circles manually. I had created accounts to kind of like watch what was going on. So I already had a good idea of where I could start scraping. So that's what I decided to do. I developed scrapers around it to pull down data, analyze that data, and kind of get a feel for like the high level discussions that were going on. Here was a problem that scrapers could solve. I needed to develop a scraper that could grab and store as much information as possible on users that were posting violent right-wing memes and evidence of illegal activities on the 6th. The problem had a reasonable scope. I wanted all the data on these sites, but the sites were much smaller than major social media companies, with users in the several thousands and daily posts in the thousands or tens of thousands at most. So I knew that this was a problem that I could technically handle. It had a reasonable enough scope, and it was a problem that I was actually interested in and like actually could have like done some good. The problem was motivating and well scoped and was reasonable to me since I had developed much more technically difficult scrapers in the past. This was actually a relatively easy undertaking in the grand scheme of things. The result was tens of thousands of archived posts and user profiles that I used to analyze activity and discussions on right-wing extremist sites in the days after the 6th. On a completely different vein, you may want to develop scrapers that gather financial data from a given financial API. A good approach to this is deciding which stocks you want to monitor. Building a list keeps you from having to scrape every single stock ticker that is available in the API, minimizing the data that you have to scrape, store, and analyze, and minimizing the load on the API servers. You also want to determine the granularity of the data that you want to gather in this case. For your application, do you need the up-to-date prices by the second, or can you just get it every 5 minutes or every hour? This is highly dependent on the application. In some cases, if you're doing like high-frequency trading, you definitely do need the by-the-second data. But if you're kind of just doing like swing trading or like less frequent trading, you can probably get away with gathering it on a much like smaller scale, a much less granular scale, that is to say. This is an application I've actually used to create cryptocurrency trading bots in the past, and it's an important and potentially very lucrative application of scrapers. It's actually very, very common in the financial world to have people who are at least reasonably adept at creating web scrapers. The problem in this case can be defined as follows. I need up-to-date, minute-by-minute data on Apple stock price to feed into a trading algorithm. This is scoped to one stock and includes the level of granularity that you'll need to scrape that data. For one more example, we have weather data. Let's just say you want the day's expected high and low temperature. Your problem is really simple. I need to know what the expected high and low temperatures are. This defines how often you need to scrape the data, probably just once per day since the high and low generally don't change, and the specific data that you want to scrape. This is like a really good 1 hour project, honestly, if that. So now you have a specific problem. Now we're going to build off of that foundation to determine the scope. Scoping is vital to scraper design and development. Scope, as discussed in the last step, is the specific boundaries that dictate what data your scraper will gather. Scraping all of Twitter is an unreasonable scope, so let's make it a little bit more reasonable. You can scrape all of the posts in the last week that include a given hashtag. That's a little bit more reasonable. It limits how many tweets you'll need to scrape and store and gives you a pretty easy way to find the new posts. You just have to search for the hashtag or hit a certain API endpoint. Proper scoping will also limit the development time that you need to spend to get the project up and running. It will limit the amount of storage you'll need for the data as well as the hardware or hosting costs required to analyze that data. Finally, and very importantly, it will limit the headaches you give web administrators. We discussed scoping quite a bit in step 1, but it deserved its own section due to its importance. Step 3. Determine how you're going to gather the data in the predefined scope. Does the website have an API that you can gain access to that offers the data that you need, or will you have to scrape the web pages themselves? If you can access the API, what kind of limits does the API have on how many requests you can make in a given period of time? If you need by the second data on a particular stock ticker, but the API only allows you to make 5 requests per minute, that's not really going to work. What endpoints will you need to hit to get the data that you need and how often? If you need to design a web page scraper, what pages will you need to scrape? How much data is on them that you'll essentially be ignoring? Is there a better way to get to that data without needing to request a bunch of useless data? How often will you need to visit these web pages for an update? These are all necessary questions that will push you to look into the design of websites and APIs. This is where scraper development experience will really help. You'll understand how APIs are designed and how most web pages are laid out. In the beginning, it really helps to dig into the API design documents and tutorials and document web page layouts and site designs. You'll get a lot of value out of documenting where your data lives and how to access it. And this step will majorly decrease development time in the future. Determining what endpoints you need to hit to get your data, what web pages you have to request to get your data, and what the best, most efficient ways to gather that data is an incredibly important question to answer very early on. Step 4. How am I going to store this data? This is probably the question that I'm least qualified to answer. I typically use MongoDB or Postgres to store all of my data, two incredibly popular data storage solutions. They are almost definitely not the best choices for all applications, but they're the ones that I'm the most familiar with. You may be designing something simple that gathers a pretty small amount of data pretty infrequently. This means you're probably safe just storing that data in a text file. Otherwise, unless you're gathering a massive amount of data and need a solution that can handle that data well, or unless you have a very niche solution that requires a certain kind of data storage solution, you're probably best just picking a popular database solution and learning it. Database design is also something that I'm not super familiar with. I can normally just get away with coming up with designs on the fly. I'm collecting posts and user information, so I'll store all the posts in the post database and all the user information in the users database with a key that ties the users and the post together. I'd honestly recommend doing some research on this topic if you think you're going to be gathering a ton of data in your scraper projects, but generally for smaller to medium-sized projects, you're okay just winging it. The most important part is having a design in place that dictates what data you'll be storing and what database using what technology. If you change the format that you use to store the data several times, you'll be dealing with headaches down the line when you actually want to analyze or use that data. I like to whiteboard my database design in a format similar to the following. I've got a user who has a unique identifier I call UID. Every user has a username, a follower count, a following count, a date the user was created, and a link. Then I've got a bunch of posts. Each post has a user ID that ties it to a specific user in the user database. Then it has a date that the post was made, a link to the post, and a post body, as well as a list of other users that were mentioned in the tweet or the post. I lay it all out like this so that I can create a checklist in my code to make sure I'm grabbing all of this data, as well as a general schema that dictates what my database will look like. So, that was a lot of information. Now we have a problem and a scope. We have a general idea on how to approach the problem programmatically by researching the site or API layout, and we have a method and general design of how we're going to store that data. We're pretty much ready to actually dive into scraper development. We'll go into the more technical weeds now in the next video of this section. Thank you so much for sticking around. I know it's been a lot of whiteboarding and a whole lot of death by PowerPoint slides and all of that ugly nonsense. I know you're kind of here for the code. Totally understand that. I promise later on all of this stuff is going to end up really paying off. You're going to be able to develop scrapers much more foundationally. You're going to understand the code before you even write it, and you're going to kind of have a general layout of your code before you ever start getting into the weeds of it, and that's really going to help. Thank you so much for sticking with this. If you have been enjoying the class or if you have recommendations on things to change, please, if you're watching this on Udemy, leave some kind of feedback in the course review. If you're watching on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment and let me know what I did wrong. If you have been enjoying it, if you're watching it on YouTube, likes and shares definitely help ton. And if you're watching on Udemy, it really helps a lot if you review the course and kind of tell me what I did right as well. Thanks so much, and I will see you in the next video.